reading today comes from Matthew chapter 5, the first 12 verses. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who went before you." May God bless the reading of the gospel. How many times do I have to tell you? And then the frustrated mother gently but firmly removed the candy bar from her child's hand and put it back on the rack. Her eyes half closed, and I could hear her suck in a deep breath, and though her lips weren't moving, I swear I could hear her mentally counting to 10 before she continued. "We're not here to buy candy in the checkout line. We're here to get healthy food." The small child frowned and turned away from the candy rack and busied himself with some other interest, and I wanted to high-five the mom. Well played. How many times do I have to tell you? Micah's exasperated words to Israel beg the same question. He has told you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. I wonder, does God suck in a divine breath and close holy eyes and count to 10 over us sometimes? The operating instructions for human flourishing are so simple. You would think God's children would have them down by now. Act justly, practice kindness, and walk humbly with your God. But like love your neighbor as yourself, these instructions are both simple and difficult. Micah was prophet to Israel in the 8th century BCE, a time when Israel was prosperous. So the nation's leaders assumed they were enjoying God's great favor in this time of plenty. Surely it was their religious devotion, their obedience to the cultic laws, their steady stream of expensive offerings that they were always bringing into the temple that were responsible for the current blessing of wealth and power that they enjoyed. They assumed it was all because God was pleased with them. But Micah begs to differ and lays out a courtroom drama where the Lord of the universe contends with God's people. While the nation was focused on purity and the complicated rituals of their religion, they were simultaneously ignoring the ethical demands of faithfulness before Yahweh. They were always ready to make another extravagant offering from their great wealth. Thousands of rams, tens of thousands of rivers of oil. What do you want from us? We will bring it into the temple. But they were not ready to pursue justice. for those in their own nation whose needs were not being met, even in this time of great plenty. Micah refutes the religious claims of the elites in his capital city because they are not backed up with ethical obedience. An exploitative economic policy that generated wealth for those who were in the urban centers and had great power at the expense of the vulnerable out in rural places. Tricks that were played within the legal system in order to concentrate land and power into the hands of a few. And deafness to the cries of growing numbers of landless poor continued unabated. Micah warns this behavior ignites God's rage, not evokes his pleasure. What is good? What does the Lord require of you? Scripture is filled with questions just like this one. One of my favorites is in Jesus' most famous story, the Good Samaritan. Which of these people proved to be a neighbor to the man who was injured? In Jesus' story, Micah's complaint finds narrative shape. The prophets focus on the tension which arises between the pursuit of pious purity and the ethical demands that God places on our daily behavior. Is sharply drawn in the figures of a lawyer and a priest who come upon an injured man who has been beaten by robbers. Spiritual blinders firmly in place that cannot be deterred from their religious obligations to help a neighbor who is struggling right before their eyes which they can easily avert. When a despised foreigner, the Good Samaritan, goes above and beyond to see to the needs of the injured party, all the stories, listeners, hear Jesus' question and they immediately know the answer. Which of these people proved to be a neighbor? And they answer in unison, the one who helped, the foreigner, the stranger. In Micah's lament over his nation's hard-heartedness toward those who are being injured by their economic system, he longs for the day when his people will know instinctively the answer to this question: what does the Lord require of you? And here's the problem, I think. It's just too easy for us to believe that we are doing what God requires of us, even when we're really doing what works for us. Surely the political and religious elite in Jerusalem felt they were the most justified and just people in the nation. They spent so much time in worship. They gave extravagantly to the needs of their gleaming worship space. They followed the purity laws obsessively. They were a people set apart to be admired and emulated. They knew what was right. And if everyone would just fall in line and do exactly as they said, others could be as richly blessed as they were. Arrogance is blind. Ellen was in the checkout lane at Meijer when her daughter Amy, who was 6 at the time, reached toward the candy rack, pointing and grunting, her eyes insistent. Ellen smiled at her, took the candy she was pointing to and gave it to the child. And the woman right behind her in line bristled and said, "You're making her a brat, you know. Just look at her. She's way too old to be riding in that cart and grunting and demanding things. You're ruining her." Ellen's cheeks burned. In the same way, I wanted to high-five the mom in front of me at the checkout for saying no to candy. This woman wanted to reprimand and correct the woman in front of her. We each saw for the briefest moment in the life of another family what we thought we understood and passed judgment with blinders firmly in place. Ellen's mind raced as she tried to speed the cashier along so she and Amy could just get out of there as quickly as possible. Of course, she thought, the woman judging her doesn't know that Amy is nonverbal and profoundly autistic, or that she keeps her in the cart in order to keep Amy safe in public places. She didn't know that today Ellen had been feeling better about herself than she has in weeks. The trip to Meyer this time had been perfect until now, whereas shopping with Amy was usually a dreaded chore. This time her daughter had been terrific, and Ellen was so happy when she handed her that candy bar. Ellen left the store stricken. Sharp criticism from a stranger combined with many not-so-perfect days with Amy, which followed for Ellen, resulted in a downward spiral towards suicidal depression. "You're ruining her," echoed in her mind day after day until she couldn't bear it. But the woman who judged her will never know that. Thankfully, in the following weeks, Ellen's neighbor proved to really be one. Observing Ellen's mental distress, she intervened and reached out just in time to get her the residential treatment required for Ellen's and Amy's safety. Who is my neighbor? And what does the Lord require of me? God has told you, O mortal, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, to do justice, to practice loving kindness, and to walk humbly with God. The instructions are so simple and so hard. Last week, I was meeting with some campus colleagues to plan several ecumenical prayer services. And we decided on 2 services together this spring, one with a Lenten theme, the other with a resurrection theme. And then we began plans for a prayer service in the fall, on the night before the November election. We were all drawn to the idea of a non-partisan ecumenical gathering to end the evening in worship right before we all went back to the polls as a nation. As we brainstormed, we realized that there were a lot of different directions such a service could go. One pastor spoke of the deep anxiety that so many in her congregation already feel surrounding the behavior of national leadership and the dysfunction of some of our institutions. We wondered if the service should focus on reducing anxiety, be still, and know that I am still God kind of approach. Another minister said, well, the night before an election is an important time, and surely we need to remind people how critical their voting decisions are to our national life. We need to remind people what the Lord requires of them. As the conversation continued, we talked about this tension between a clear focus on seeking justice and the thirst that we all have for more experience of God's eternal loving kindness and the loving kindness from one another. Surely worship at all times of year needs to help us with both. And surely humility is the key to keeping the balance. In the end, we decided on the theme, calling on God. We recognized that through the prophets, the Psalms, and the Gospels, we learn that in our prayers, it is right for us to include calls to justice, calls for help in our times of personal need, and calls for refuge and strength in anxious times. I thought of Micah's prayers for a revival in his country's worship life that would get the balance right. So many little personal moments, like how we interact with a stranger at a supermarket checkout. Huge national moments, like deciding the direction of the world's most powerful nation. And all the moments in between. How will we know what God requires? Micah 6:8 gives us a rubric to use for all these decisions which weave the fabric of our community life, which we are always building together. And the rubric is replete with question marks. Am I being just toward others, especially those in greatest need today? Am I practicing kindness toward all, even those with whom I fiercely disagree? Am I walking humbly in this world and allowing God to guide me? Questions for the faithful. Let us prepare now to come to the table, where we are reminded that our God is not only just, but also merciful, where grace abounds and all are welcomed. Come and share in the feast of God.